right. Well, the next session, as you see, is titled The Continuing Struggle for Afghanistan, as well as Indo-Pakistan Relations. And to moderate this afternoon's panel, we're very pleased to have with us Catherine Herridge. Catherine is an award-winning chief intelligence correspondent for the Fox News Channel based in Washington. She covers intelligence, of course, the Justice Department, and the Department of Homeland Security. Catherine joined Fox News in 1996 as a London-based correspondent. Her most recent book, published by Crown, is called The Next Wave: On the Hunt for Al Qaeda's American Recruits. She's a graduate of Harvard and the Columbia School of Journalism, and Catherine began her career as a London-based correspondent for ABC News. Please join me in welcoming Catherine and this terrific panel.
Thank you very much for being here. It's such a pleasure to be here in London as part of the debut of ASF Global. I want to congratulate Clark and his team, also for graciously hosting us, and to all of you for being so invested in these security issues. As we all know, the threat does not respect boundaries, and this is certainly the case now. I'd like to begin by introducing the panel. Next to me is Sumantra Bose, a professor at the London School of Economics who specializes in international and comparative politics. Also, Hina Rabbani Kar, former foreign minister of Pakistan. Michael Clark, former director general of the Royal United Services Institute, and then also at the end, the Afghan president's special envoy and ambassador to Pakistan, Hazrat Omar Zakirwal. So thank you very much. We're 15 years after 9/11. Ambassador, I'd like to begin with you. What has been accomplished by the military intervention, and how has it contributed to the current state, which is unstable in Afghanistan?
Well, a lot. 15 years ago, or prior to 9/11, we had this brutal Taliban regime that I do not need to describe what it was. So the end of it, and instead replaced by democratic institutions with progress on all fronts, particularly women, and of course other development indicators, and that Afghanistan became part of a responsible global community. So those are just a few of the significant sort of changes and achievements that there were of the past 15 years. But of course, there are challenges, and I'm sure that we will come back and talk about those.
The challenges, just specifically in terms of the military intervention. You had said to me that because there was such significant damage to Afghanistan, and particularly in terms of collateral damage, that this did go some way to increasing the radicalization on the ground. If you could just elaborate.
Yeah. Well, there are two questions that we need to ask. One, of course, as in Afghans, what they wish that the international community's intervention had not taken place, the answer would be no. What they wish that the international community, as well as, of course, Afghan leadership, had handled the situation, and that includes the war on terrorism. That includes, again, certain other goals that were added to the intervention, which included the state-building process, in development, in governance, in democracy, in regional harmony, and all that. Could have handled it differently so that we could have peace. Now, we have a different regime, but to have peace and stability in the country, the answer is yes, it could have been handled differently. Because while we achieved those I just mentioned, we do not have peace. We do not have stability. We are not sure about the future. Anything can happen. So we certainly, the last thing we would want to see is to reverse on the progress we have had, and God forbids, in certain areas, go back to where we were 15 years ago or before 15 years ago.
Ms. Carr, I'd like to bring you in. Do you feel that the international community had a realistic set of objectives in Afghanistan?
Thank you for that. And if I were somebody who was living in the United States of America or in Europe, my answer would probably be yes. But since I don't have the luxury of living in outside of the region, and I'm happy to be living in the region that I am, I don't think it can be said, right? Because, and simply to answer your question, I think I'm going to do it from two angles. One is a rather broad brush looking at what happened, and then analyzing as to what could possibly be the contributing factors to why the ideal situation isn't there. So about $1 trillion spent on this intervention, $100 billion altogether in economic assistance to Afghanistan in the last 15 years. And as I said, as somebody who's coming from that region, if you ask me, the entry goals were probably unrealistic, okay? And if you were to broadly summarize the entry goals, they have to be at least the following three. One, that we don't want religious extremism to grow in that area, and it was because of religious extremism in that area and Al Qaeda being, stationed there that the attack happened or the intervention happened in the first place. So you don't want religious extremism to grow. You want more stability in the region, right? So the region could also go in, of course, in Afghanistan. And you obviously don't want this to be a bastion of drugs, etc., right? On all three counts, for instance, if I were to look at from Pakistan's vantage point, pre-9/11, there was only one suicide bomb attack in Pakistan. Post-9/11, post-intervention, we've had so many hundreds that we've lost count. We've lost, of course, close to 50,000 people altogether. The Afghans are probably the only ones who compare to us because they have also lost about as many, if not more, civilians. We have lost about 5,000 to 7,000 paramilitary forces, military forces within that time. So clearly on that front, if you say more stability, I would say the answer has to be no. Then let's take drugs. Back in 2001, there was 8,000 hectares of cultivation of opium within Afghanistan. In 2014, the number, according to UNODC, is 224,000. That's a 28 times more. So these are the real facts. So I would love to be able to give you a happy answer and say, yes, interventions worked well, we are at a much happier place than we were, but the facts speak otherwise for that region. Now, what could be primarily the 2 or 3 or 4, or let's say 4 big factors for that? First of all, I believe the goals were unrealistic. The entry goals were very, very unrealistic. And if you look at now the exit realities, we seem to be very comfortable because domestic opinion doesn't support staying on in Afghanistan anymore. We seem to be very comfortable with the exit realities, and we want to broad brush that in an Alice in Wonderland type of a way to say that all's well. So unrealistic goals. You wanted to create a Switzerland in an area which would probably not support Switzerland type of way. You wanted to do everything at the same time. You were not able to pick and choose. You wanted girls to go to school, an excellent goal, and at the same time you wanted democratic values exactly the way they are in the United States of America, unrealistic. So factor number 1, unrealistic entry goals. Factor number 2, related to that, you wanted to create structures and institutions which had nothing to do with the local realities, okay? And on that, when I speak as a Pakistani, I'm obviously, whatever I say is taken with a pinch of salt because I'm not supposed to want stability in Afghanistan, whereas I get the most affected by instability in Afghanistan. So the structures, the institutions that we wanted to create together, because I consider myself part of that international coalition, were alien to the society, to the tribal. And when I say tribal, I don't mean it at all, because many people think saying tribal in some ways is taking away something from the strength of Afghanistan. Not at all, it's just the reality. So is my country, many parts of my country, tribal. You cannot undo that reality. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, we all were so convinced about how we knew to solve the Afghan problem that we had neither the patience nor the care to listen to what the Afghans had to say. So we thought we had the solutions in London and in DC, and yes, closest to home in Islamabad, but nobody had the patience to really listen to what the Afghans possibly thought was. And typically, there's so many conferences I end up attending where we're discussing Afghanistan without the Afghans being in the room, right? And this happens at the government level also. Surprise, surprise. But because we all think we know what is best for Afghanistan so well that we really don't need to even consult the Afghans, forget everything else. And lastly, clearly, the Iraq war, and now with the not so new, but the knowledge that we went into the Iraq war with wrong information given to the Security Council, it becomes a harder truth to deal with. The Iraq war took away attention from Afghanistan, that's a fact. And then, of course, by the time the attention came back, Obama years, how many forces to come, it was possibly, it's never too late. Even today, it is not too late. So I'm an optimist. I'm by all means an optimist. But it was too late in being able to correctly do the intervention to be able to achieve at least some goal. So I will just end by saying that, you know, sometimes it's important to pick what is really important. So when we say everything is a priority and you want to fix everything at the same time, you'll end up fixing very little, if nothing.
Sumantra, is that also your assessment?
Yes, in part. You know, I'll speak right now in this opening comment as a comparativist who's worked on international state-making and peace-building interventions in other parts of the world. It's very important to remember that international interventions that are aimed at, state rebuilding in this case, kind of a monumental and complex task, and peace building at the same time, are by nature, by definition, notoriously complex and difficult. So in a way, they are soft targets for all sorts of critics. You know, one can easily, pick apart the premises, the assumptions of the intervention in the first place, strategies, tactics. There's so much going wrong. There's bad news coming out of what seems to be a basket case all the time, and so on and so forth. But it's also important to remember, I think, that what has necessitated these international interventions that are so easily, criticized and kind of trashed, as soft targets, is that these places were in dire and desperate straits in any case. And that's what necessitated these international interventions in the first place. Beyond that, I think that where there is, significant armed activity, certain kinds of this category of intervention take place in post-war contexts, post-war societies, where an armed conflict is winding down or is over for whatever reason, while others take place in, war contexts, where an armed conflict, often very complicated, is ongoing or unfolding or restarting. When there is insurgency going on, there is very significant foreign armed presence and activity on the soil of a particular country. It's very likely to elicit a certain kind of a patriotic resistance, which is not intrinsically a bad or an evil sentiment, whether one agrees with its particular manifestation and articulation or not. It's kind of natural. The last point I want to make before I wind up is that there's a very legitimate topic for discussion here, whether, by nature, protracted international interventions, there are no quick fixes, no quick exits, are doing more harm than good, or doing more good than harm. When some of my students write papers on this topic, whatever the case or cases the studies may be, they often pitch it as success or failure. And I try to suggest to them sometimes that it might be more useful to frame it as, is it doing more good than harm, or is it doing more harm than good? If the latter, then the intervention does need to be fundamentally rethought. But if the former, then perhaps there is some room for optimism, very cautiously in a very qualified way, as I think the ambassador expressed. But I completely agree with Minister Carr, who's right at the outset really succinctly described many of the things that have been wrong from the outset with the foreign presence and intervention in Afghanistan, whether premises, assumptions, or strategies, tactics.
Michael, what could we have done differently with the benefit of hindsight?
I think there is an alternative explanation. I don't disagree with anything that former Minister Carr said in terms of the mistakes that were made and the lack of foresight. But I think there's an alternative interpretation from a more parochial point of view in, say, the United Kingdom, the United States about this, which is that Afghanistan, in a sense, the operation in Afghanistan contained what potentially larger problem. And I absolutely agree that the Iraq war drew attention away. So 5 years were wasted after really 2002 in the politics of South Asia. But there was a sense, I think, that built up, and this wasn't there at the beginning, it could have been, but it wasn't, but a sense built up in 2003 that if the Western world, the alliance, just withdrew from its responsibilities in Afghanistan, it was justified to do something about the Taliban in 2001. Should we then have withdrawn completely? And the sense built up that, well, if we'd done that, Afghanistan might even have split between a northern Kabul and Herat and a southern Kandahar. And that would have put real pressure on the Durand Line and the Pashtun heartland, which would have created a bigger South Asia problem. And so staying involved, trying to make a success of the Afghan operation was a way of containing a broader problem. And I think that's an alternative way of thinking about it geopolitically. But it left us with two problems. One problem was that by the end, by 2010, increasingly Western involvement could not affect the outcome. Usually, if you think back to either colonial periods or successful counterinsurgency, external forces don't withdraw until they know pretty well what's going to happen in the next 4 or 5 years. They know pretty well what they're leaving behind. This wasn't the case here. So we arrived at the point where we didn't really know. It might be successful. It might indeed, but we can't guarantee it. We don't know. It's out of our hands. And that's a fairly uncomfortable situation. And the second is this question of possible strategic failure. From the point of view of certainly Britain, some of the other NATO countries, and to a lesser extent the United States, we still face the prospect of the perception of strategic failure, in a very simple way. If terrorist operations aimed against this country appear to be planned in Afghanistan, whether they're successful or not, the public will say, what on earth were we doing for 10 years if they are still attacking us from Afghanistan? And that is a real worry, I think, within British government, because the perception of 1 or 2 terrorist operations could change the public mood altogether. And in that respect, we still face the prospect, whatever happens in Kabul, of the sense of strategic failure.
Having spoken to the panelists in advance, one area of consensus is that the problem requires a regional approach. So with that in mind, Ambassador, how will Afghanistan strike a balance in its relationship between India and Pakistan?
First, let me a quick let's say response to what Michael said.
Have I provoked you?
Yeah. I do not think, I absolutely do not think that Afghanistan would have been split into 2 if the forces had withdrawn after the defeat of the Taliban. Certainly we've gone through a lot worse prior to that, and we have not seen death into materializing, even though, of course, there were a lot of pundits who expected that split. And we do not believe that even in the future, even if things get worse, that's going to happen. But I do believe, you see, we'll come back to the regional issue because as to what went wrong, there were many things. Iraq was certainly a factor that played into it. The goals was not so much in issue because they were, as an Afghan, certainly supported, but how they were delivered with heavy footprints of the foreigners. Then, of course, I agree with Minister Carr that even though if the capacity was not there within the Afghan institutions, but still relying more on those because that would have been sustainable, more sustainable. Certainly the goals would not have been as just of high-reaching goals, but still would have been goals that would have been more sustainable. And also, there was no exit strategy by foreigners. When international forces came to Afghanistan, there was, they played as if they were there forever. And when there was talk about exit, it was not because things were going well, but because things were going badly. Right. And that was not the right time to be talking about exit when things became worse. On the regional, I do believe that we, together, Afghanistan as well as our international partners, have not handled the regional dimensions of Afghanistan. If there was any sort of involvement of region, it was more focused on fight against terrorism, which was, of course, Afghanistan was more concerned about. Then it was about broader set of issues. This could have included, of course, regional economic integration. Investments could have been made in this. Even of the money that came to Afghanistan, some of that portion, if had been spent on regional integration, we would probably be in a lot different situation with Pakistan, as well as with other regional countries than we are today. And also, I think we did not balance properly, and by we, I do mean Afghanistan, the relationship between India and Pakistan. In return, Pakistan absolutely based its policy vis-a-vis Afghanistan from Indian angle, and it continues to be so. And that is the most difficult, let's say, issue right now. While there are so many factors that contributed to where we are or how things went, let's say, badly, but those are history. Right now, it is the Pakistan-Indian-Afghan relationship that will have to be focused upon if we are to get it right, if we are to get out of where we are today.
Minister, what assurances would Pakistan need to allow a stronger relationship between Afghanistan and India to go forward?
Okay, again, I have to say, in a utopian world and in an idealistic setting and in the type of relations that we would eventually want to garner with Afghanistan, I believe we should require no assurances for a sovereign state to pursue its relations with another sovereign state. It should be well within their means, and they have every right to pursue whatever. So they will pursue relations with the countries which they feel, which inspire more trust and confidence for the Afghans. So I consider it to be a wrong if we view everything. I would want to somewhat disagree with it, but I will accept the reality in the statement that Ambassador has made, because it is true that there has been a general fear in Pakistan as to how India will be using Afghan soil, and there's obviously been evidence of that and counter evidence, et cetera, et cetera. We've all been playing these games, right? So there has been a concern as to how India would use Afghan soil to be able to plan, separatism, et cetera, within Pakistan. And it was generally believed that if there was linkages between the militaries and there was training, which is happening, I have to acknowledge that as one of the big steps that President Ashraf Ghani took, as many steps that he took to try and inculcate that confidence in Pakistan. So there's military training of Afghan nationals happening in Pakistan. And that is obviously, it gives a lot of trust, I guess. But I just want to look at this situation. I do want to talk a bit more about, this regional approach that you said, because to be quite honest, having served as Pakistan's foreign minister for almost 2.5 years, I don't think there's a dearth of regional conferences or sit-downs, trilaterals, quadrilaterals. I mean, literally 50% of my entire time as foreign minister of Pakistan was consumed by quadrilaterals and trilaterals on, and Doug Lute is laughing for obvious reasons. So on Afghanistan, and did that solve the situation? Will more quadrilaterals and trilaterals in the region sitting together in the RECAs and the Heart of Asia conferences, will they all solve? Because till the time that the trust, remains an issue, and there is constant friction in countries bilaterally trusting each other, whether it is Pakistan, India, China, India, Iran, Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan. Bilaterally, those relations have to really improve, and trust has to be inspired before other things can happen. And so the regional situation, it has to be centered around Afghanistan. I think this is how I want to put it, because every country has to normalize and develop its trust and relationship with Afghanistan, and that can then, through that road, we can go to various tributaries which might inspire more confidence.
Sumantra, how can that trust be developed, and is there a role in this for India and Iran?
Yeah, sure. I know we've moved on from the first point of discussion, but very briefly, I do very much agree with what Minister Carr said, in particular about trying to fix everything all at once. I think that's a very important point because I've worked on international peace-building intervention post-war in Bosnia-Herzegovina, for example, in the former Yugoslavia, and that's precisely one of the conclusions I drew from what was wrong with international intervention. There were many things wrong, and one of those was this tendency to try and fix everything, to poke your nose in everything, and you do run the risk of ending up fixing nothing. And so a modest and more focused set of goals may in the end leave the least divisive and most usable legacy for Afghans themselves to build on in the future. Now, moving on to this question, let me be utopian for a second. Looking ahead, 2 decades or even close to a half century from now, because clearly the quote-unquote problem of Afghanistan is not going to go away. It's going to be with us for a long time. Certainly, any sort of stable, settled, reasonably peaceful Afghanistan, and I use all those terms in a qualified way, can that sort of a positive scenario, not perfect but relatively positive, something the Afghans themselves, the region and the world can live with, which is not the case now, that can only be anchored in a reasonably stable and settled regional neighborhood, which is at peace with itself. Let me say something about the India-Pakistan angle to this. In Pakistan, for the most part, rightly or wrongly, Indian and Pakistani engagement with and involvement in Afghanistan is seen as a zero-sum game, that it can't be tolerated. Now, one can agree or disagree with this notion of strategic depth and so on, whether that strategic doctrine is outdated or is not outdated. I'm not going into that. Now, nobody in India, and there are plenty of mad people in India, but nobody in India is mad enough to think that Pakistan cannot or will not or should not play a role in Afghanistan. It's simply absurd. But in Pakistan, there should also, I think, be a realization that India does have long-standing ties, trade, commercial, cultural, educational ties. There's the soft power of Bollywood, which is very influential at the popular level of Afghanistan. That's not going to just go away. And since the overthrow of the Taliban regime in late 2001, Indian governments have been consistently engaged with Afghanistan in seemingly benign ways, most of the time, at least what's publicly known, road building, development assistance, all sorts of things like that, opening of embassies and consulates in various parts of Afghanistan. Now, something interesting did happen a few months ago, when the Indian Prime Minister Modi stopped over on a surprise visit in Pakistan, I think deliberately on the way back from Afghanistan, where he had just spoken in Kabul at, if I'm not getting it wrong, Ambassador, the opening of the Afghan Parliament building, which has been built with Indian assistance? Or?
All by Indians.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I think Modi decided to stop over in Pakistan to send a signal, to send a gesture of reassurance. At least I think that's what was intended at the benign level, that India's relationship with Afghanistan doesn't necessarily have to be viewed as being at the expense of Pakistan and the Pakistan-Afghanistan relationship, which of course is tremendously central to Afghanistan, because Pakistan has this huge border with Afghanistan, which India doesn't have. So, maybe that signal, that attempted gesture of reassurance is something worth thinking about, because Modi, who's going to be around till 2019, at least, he may not be around after that, but that's still another 3 years. He's gone from being a kind of a controversial provincial leader to being a still controversial but dominant national figure. And he clearly harbors ambitions of being a global statesman. And the stepping stone to being any sort of global statesman is being a regional peacemaker. So perhaps people's personal ambitions can also be harnessed to good and noble causes in the longer term. The last point, I've spoken long enough, but this is commonsensical, this is self-evident, that there has to, the neighborhood powers, and above all, Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, and India, in that order of importance, I would put them, can play and have to play the major role both in the immediate term and in that longer term of 2 decades or a half century from now in bringing a semblance of stability to Afghanistan. That's where remote distant powers like the United States, Britain, and various other countries that have been involved have a natural kind of a deficit because they're remote, they're not from the region, they're culturally alien. And so clearly a regional multilateral approach is the way to go.
Michael, I'd like to bring you in to respond. And also, is there any role here for China, given its economic interests in Afghanistan?
Yes, there is. I think it's one of the new elements that Western foreign officers have got to take into account, which is potentially quite constructive, in fact, very constructive if we get used to it. I mean, China has a very small border with Afghanistan, 56, 57 miles, but they worry partly that it will relate to the politics in Xinjiang and the Uyghur problem. They worry about spillover effects or safe havens on the Afghanistan side of the border for what they say is their terrorist problem. I think that's massively overstated by the Chinese, incidentally, but that's what they say. But I think there's a much more interesting motivation for China's much asserted recent interest, which is the One Belt, One Road, the new Silk Road. And this real initiative to create this new Silk Road, just look at the map. Afghanistan is intrinsically a crossroads. And if you look at the other stands, the smaller stands, apart from Kazakhstan, but Tajikistan and Turkmenistan to the west, Kyrgyzstan, if Afghanistan were unstable, that will certainly be difficult for the One Belt, One Road project to cope with. And Afghanistan should be intrinsically part of it. But as we know, the infrastructure in South Asia is not very good. I was at a meeting only 2 weeks ago in Delhi where we spent almost 4 days lamenting the lack of common infrastructures between South Asian countries. And the Chinese see that that's a massive problem for their One Belt, One Road vision of a new Silk Road from China into Western Europe. So they have a big interest, and as a result of that, they didn't put any aid into Afghanistan to speak of until 2014, and now there's about $300 million worth, some military, mainly non-military, $250 million worth for the next 3 years. They've got themselves involved in a peace process. They're shuttling between President Ghani and Prime Minister Sharif, not with much effect at the moment, but they've started this quadrilateral coordination arrangement from the beginning of this year. It's had some meetings, and so they're giving it a go. And that is a very interesting development, which wasn't there in the background before, and they've got oil and copper interests around Kabul and in the north of the country. So it's something to take account of, and it's something that I think the West should try to work with when we think about a regional approach.
Before we open it up to questions, I'd like a quick answer from everyone on the following, if that's possible. Based on our discussions, there was a consensus that U.S. influence in the region is receding, and the countries gaining influence, Russia, China, and Iran. Does this present an opportunity on the Afghan question? I'll begin with Ms. Carr.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a huge opportunity, and I think it's not a competitive opportunity, whereas what I mean to say is that the US is not unhappy with other countries playing a bit of a leadership role, as US's own interest is waning from this area. And I think it's extremely important. It might not be very pertinent to the current discussion, but becomes very, very pertinent if you look at the bigger picture. That the US's interest and the US's Asia pivot has nothing to do with the part of Asia that I come from. That Asia pivot is very, very China containment, if you want to look at it slightly that way. But even if you want to look at vastly positively, it's got to do with East Asia. That pivot has got to do with East Asia. So their influence and their interest in this area is waning. Their interest in that area is obviously increasing. Some of the Middle East interest is actually being taken away and going into that area. And within all of that, you have China really now being comfortable with asserting itself as an emerging superpower, which was not the case before, mind you. So about 2 years back, maybe 3 to 4 years back, initially when I started off as foreign minister, I remember very clearly that China did not want to obviously play a role in the peace process, for instance. They wanted to give the impression that they weren't really the type of big power that would want to, because it obviously has a cost, as we've seen in the case of the US. Playing a role has a cost because failure
Same in
has
the
a
Middle
cost.
East. Same in the Middle East. There was kind of free riders on everyone else's diplomacy.
Absolutely. So as China is taking this role, I think it's a happy place for them to be. It can only be a force of good. The investment that they're making, because many Europeans and Americans get very concerned about economic imperialism of China within this area and other Central Asia, I think it's a force of good. If you invest in infrastructure, it can only be a force of good. Had the US also invested the $100 billion of economic assistance that it gave to Afghanistan in various forms only in their infrastructure, believe you me, as an aid recipient country, it would have done much more good and had much more results in Afghanistan than all of the money that went away in sectors which we thought we knew better to fix.
Ambassador, do you also agree that there is an opening now?
Definitely. First of all, the rise in Chinese interest with respect to, again, security and economics in the region is encouraging. Also, the US-Chinese engagement, again, on Afghanistan regional issue is definitely encouraging. The China is viewed both by Pakistan and by Afghanistan, probably the only common neighbor that we both believe that cannot have anything but positive intentions for the region, for its own sake, both for security, as was mentioned, and for its economic ambitions that we are supportive of. We are supportive of this, again, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CEPA. We are supportive of its One Belt, One Road project. We certainly would want them to come and invest in Afghanistan, and there is Chinese interest in that as well. And we also understand China's concern with respect to, again, EITM in Xinjiang province, in its concerns, again, with respect to instability and how those elements could use Afghanistan to destabilize China. So all those elements putting together, and then China's coming forward in involvement in it, is something that we view positively. And I do hope that it will produce, again, a very constructive sort of broker's role, particularly between us and Pakistan. Because at the end, the one thing that could really change the situation of Afghanistan, it's Afghanistan-Pakistan relationship. Mm-hmm. Right now, there is absolutely no trust between these two countries. Mm-hmm. And for us to be hopeful, there has to be some positive sort of developments on that front. And I do believe that China can play a role.
Okay, I'd like to open it up for a couple of questions before we wrap up. Right here in the back.
Thank you. I'm Jennifer Glass. I'm a correspondent who's been based in Afghanistan for 5 years. I wanted to ask about the Pakistan-Afghanistan relationship. It seems to be deteriorating, especially in the wake of the attack on Tuesday. The intelligence services has blamed that on the Haqqani network in Pakistan. Dr. Abdullah has canceled his trip next month to Pakistan. What is going on with the relationship, and what does that mean for the prospect of peace talks with the Taliban? And is there any concern about the continuity of the National Unity Government past what Afghans believe was a 2-year deadline at the end of September in the absence of a Loya Jirga to ratify Dr. Abdullah's position?
Oh, definitely.
One for you.
Definitely it's me. The Tuesday attack was absolutely a setback for the recent progresses that Afghanistan and Pakistan had made. But I hope with this, again, this extremely tragic event as it is, that it could now be used as an opportunity for, let's say, self-pressure to be more constructive. I can only tell you this, that I believe that the Tuesday attack has pushed certain efforts that are encouraging. At least that is, again, I was in the back there, and of course, back and forth with respect to these issues. And I hope that some positive developments emerge in the next couple of days that could give us some, again, some hope. And those positive developments, if they do emerge, could not have been foreseen this quickly if it were not for the last Tuesday attack.
Ms. Carr.
Yeah. Look, I think one of the major problems, and maybe I should have mentioned it as the problem in the, as the fifth problem, the fact that we decided, even post-intervention, to let the border area between Pakistan and Afghanistan remain as fluid as it is a huge source of both problem between Pakistan and Afghanistan, trust building, and for the stability and security of Afghanistan and for the stability and security of Pakistan. So to anyone who charges Pakistan with providing safe havens to the Haqqani network, and I'm going to just answer, say this categorically because I don't think there's any hoodwinking this particular issue, or the Afghan Taliban. Okay, the reality is that this border area is so, and the border management is so bad and fluid that 60,000 people, for instance, cross the border, one border crossing every day. Only one border crossing, right? With no visas, with no passports, there's no telling. And when we tried to put biometric systems, etc., it was resisted. Instead of encouraging the international community presence in Afghanistan, instead of encouraging that, it was actually resisted. So it is really, I truly believe that it is one of the primary factors which can have an influence on another primary factor that Ambassador Umar referred to. It can build the trust between Pakistan and Afghanistan. So that's one factor. And the other is that, let's be clear, I don't think Pakistan has ever denied the fact that there are certain Afghans, whether, so they can be from any of the various groups that have been living in Afghanistan together with the about 3 million Afghan refugees that Pakistan has been hosting for the last 3 decades now. Now, Pakistan has limited capacity to be able to deal with the many, many terrorist groups which have attacked Pakistan itself. Okay, so the first, you deal with those who are attacking you, and then you try and create the circumstances to enable dealing with those who are attacking others. So we're trying to do both things at the same time. And I'm encouraged by the statement by Ambassador Umar that there is encouraging interaction, and hopefully we will try and, the two countries will fight through this.
I'm afraid this time only for that one question, because I'd like to get some final thoughts from the panel. I'd like to begin with you, Michael. As we look forward, what will you see as indicators of progress, and what will you see as signs of further concern in Afghanistan?
For me, indicators of progress are the survival of Afghan institutions and another smooth transition. The fact is, the transition from President Karzai to President Ghani occurred. It happened. One of the interesting things I always think was that whenever we, in the West, we looked at Afghan elections, we always said, is this election fair? Is it free? Is it legitimate? Afghans don't mind as long as there was a result. In the sense that they just wanted a result. And if there is another result, that's a sign of progress. And as we were saying, I think, regional ownership of parts of the problem. And that's something that Western powers haven't thought through properly, I think, and need to do that much, much, much more. So for me, those would be the two signs. Survival of the Afghan government and that sense of regional involvement for all of the problems that we know it brings. It is the only way forward.
Sumantra, what do you see as the indicators of progress versus the signs of concern?
Well, one point that I haven't mentioned is that the sort of coming in of Iran from the cold, this is, of course, without endorsing the Islamic Republic and its particular form of polity, is potentially a very positive development because this means that potentially Iran can become a full member, being brought on board of this multilateral international strategy to stabilize Afghanistan. And the Iran factor is often, overlooked, that it's the kind of the other neighbor,
right.
After Pakistan or along with Pakistan. looking at the geopolitical angle, regionally primarily, however, this somewhat utopian multilateral regional approach may, of course, it is putting the cart before the horse at this stage of the conversation, because there are a couple of toxic relationships that need to improve significantly first, one being the Pakistan-Afghanistan relationship, broadly defined. Of course, one can unpack that, but let's leave it as the Pakistan-Afghanistan relationship that's been referred to already. The other is the Pakistan-India relationship, which also impinges on Afghanistan. So it seems that any progress on Afghanistan towards that kind of that utopian future of relative stability, sort of lasting peace, is contingent on kind of incremental progress on improving these two toxic relationships, the Pakistan-Afghanistan one being obviously the central one, but the Pakistan-India one is the secondary one. But I think in the longer term there is space, in the medium term I would say there is space, because if we again take a step back from this quagmire, or what looks like a horrible quagmire, regardless of some progress, some positive indicators, what's the balance of the forces that want a perennially disturbed and violent Afghanistan, and with the forces that do not want that, that want that other kind of future outcome. And if the forces that do not want a perennially violent and disturbed Afghanistan can be brought together in sort of a, to use language from Indian politics, a common minimum program, okay, because it necessarily is a political coalition of disparate interests, then I think there is hope in both the near term and the medium term.
Ms. Carr, your final thoughts?
Yeah. To me, I think again, I will use my own sort of, I will use what I said, apply what I said in the beginning to myself also, because I think you cannot have 10 priorities. You have to have priority as what is the most important. And to me, clearly, peace and stability from Afghan standards, not Swiss standards, okay? So every year, there is more stability in Afghanistan than the previous year. Now, again, I do not want to be a pessimist, but the facts are that currently there are more Afghans leaving Afghanistan than refugees flow coming into Afghanistan, which means that Afghans are not finding the situation to be better than the previous year. And 2015 has actually been the deadliest year in terms of violence, both for the military and for the civilians. So so what would be success? Indicator of success, a marker of success in the future. More Afghans are coming back into Afghanistan than those that are leaving Afghanistan. Less Afghan military is deserting and dying because of violence within Afghanistan. So peace talks will have to be really, as to how much to give to whom, has to be an Afghan decision. And all of us can only be supportive of that. And I think the time is there where Pakistan will obviously be fully supportive of whatever role it can possibly play, potentially a positive one. And lastly, I do want to say this, upholding the Afghan economy. You see, because as the aid money is dwindling away, the Afghan economy is obviously suffering, and that obviously has a direct effect on peace, stability, and the future that Afghans see for themselves in Afghanistan.
Ambassador?
Well, first, I just want to assure Michael, because he mentioned a success indicator, the political survivor, I would take it, of the Afghan government, that it will survive politically. So I be rest assured. Of course, there is widespread disappointment of the government, but at the same time, nobody would, and by no I mean the politicians or the oppositions who are out there, would want to push for the collapse of the government, because we know then the consequences of that. It's to nobody's benefit, and that's very well understood. For me, over the next few months, it has to be over the next few months, otherwise we could be in some serious trouble. Some positive development on the roadmap of the quadrilateral. And development, again, that's on peace talks. If peace talks do begin with the support from Pakistan, then of course, what that by itself is an extremely significant development in our relationship with Pakistan. Because as much as for us it's important to make progress on peace talks with Taliban, it's important that we make progress with Pakistan. So those are the two fronts. We'll be watching. If they do not happen, let's say, over the spring or summer, then they may become more and more difficult, and therefore we might even get into sort of a worse situation than we are today.
Thank you to the panel for informing us and for your candid and direct assessments on the problem, and thank you to all of you for attending this afternoon.